So I mentioned making this video about 2 years ago when Tomoe officially dropped on the JP side of things because we have so many Buster AoE archers and they all kind of do different things that I thought, hey, this would be a really interesting video once I get to use Tomoe a little bit more and I have a real opinion on him. I'll go ahead and make this video, but then we just started getting more content, and then, you know, I kind of just forgot about the idea, put it on the back burner. But with him releasing on the NA side of things, I figured now would be a good time to do a video like this. By the way, if there's any other type of video in the same style you'd like me to do for, say, Buster AoE Sabers or single target quick assassins or whatever have you, I'll be down to do those. I love, again, talking about all things FGO, so having these discussions I think are very fun. Now, I couldn't fit all this in the title because it'd be a little too long, but I am focusing on just the 5-star Buster AoE archers. Because if I were to look at all of the Buster AoE archers, it might be a little more difficult to do this in a concise and quick manner, or at least as concise and quick as I can really do these things. Now, if you're not familiar with who these are and you want to know exactly who we're going to be looking at, that includes Arjuna, Ishtar, Tomoe, Gilgamesh, and Tesla. And I'm going to be working from best to worst because I think that's an easier way to do these videos. I know that's breaking the golden rule for getting retention in the videos, but it is way easier for me to actually go through and say, oh, I think this guy is better than this guy, we move down one, than it is to be all mysterious and hide the facts of who the number one is. I just don't like doing that. It's harder for me to make, I think, a better video if I'm doing it that way. So, as per usual, make sure you drop a like on the video and you subscribe to the channel if you like this style of content. And also go ahead in the comments down below, leave who your top 5, I think it is. I think there's 5 Buster AoE archers in the comments down below because I'd like to see how my opinion might differ from other people. But with that being said, let's start jumping right into this video. I really wanted to put Gilgamesh at number 1 because, as many of you guys know, he is my favorite person in the entirety of Fate. I just absolutely love this dude, but even I can't be so delusional as to deny Tesla his proper spot as the number 1 Buster AoE archer that we have right now. This guy literally has everything. When it comes to just good standard damage, his base damage is already very solid, but then he has very good power mods in Earth and Sky. Now, Sky on its own is normally not all that great because it's a very small selection of servants, but being able to hit those Sky servants as well as the large options that you have going into Earth is pretty sick. I mean, the guy pierces invincibility. He has a 50% battery, which is about as big as you're standardly going to get. He even has survivability in a Guts. He now guarantees his own defense and NP damage buff, so now he's even a little thicker when going into battles, and again, it has more free damage. And then, as if to almost fix the fact that he is a very old servant, so his, hits on his arts cards and stuff aren't super high for refunding NP, they not only gave him a massive 50% NP gain buff, but then they also allowed him to give the entire party a 30% NP gain buff as well. So if you're using him with, say, a Merlin, a Castoria, because you want to have extra survivability, you're using him with even a Waver, even that, he's going to work really nicely with them because he's actually giving them something that is really beneficial. You guys know that I rag on different DPSs that, say, give a party-wide attack buff, or they give an NP damage buff to everybody, because realistically you're probably going to use 1 DPS and 2 supports, unless maybe you're doing a 90+ multi-core setup where you want to have those extra buffs for, say, a single target or another AoE you're bringing, but that's not all that frequent. If you're going into a fight, you're probably just going to have 2 supports, and giving them NP gain I think is really nice. They also threw a debuff success rate on there because his NP already has a 40% chance to stun all of the enemies, so now that's just almost guaranteed, although I would argue you probably do want that debuff success rate because people do often have stuff like magic resistance that cuts down on your ability to hit them with the stun. But again, that's another really neat thing that he has. I mean, his NP's been upgraded, so the base damage is really good. He just kinda has everything. If you were to ask me, ZTL, what would you give this guy? What further buffs could you chuck his way to make him better? And I really couldn't think of anything outside of maybe buffing his base hits, but they talked about doing that, I think, in year 3 or 4, and they still haven't been able to do it, so I don't really know if they're going to ever get around to doing that. But honestly, I think the only thing he's missing is a crit buff, which technically he does have in his passives because archers have that independent action skill, so he does technically have a passive 8% crit damage buff, but I don't really know if that counts as a true crit damage buff. I mean, at least make it 20%. So if they were to buff him in the future by, I don't know, maybe buffing his third skill, slapping maybe an additional 10 stars on that, and then allowing him to get a 30 to 50% crit damage buff, I think he would literally have everything you could possibly give him. I don't think you could give him anything more. So I'm sorry also to all of my Gilgamesh fans out there that are like me, but I just can't put him at number 1 because Tesla just has pretty much everything. Although for second place, I definitely can give it to my boy Gilgamesh. I think the only thing that we're lacking with him is some metric of survivability, which is very strange because if you played Fate Stay Night, he quite literally catches Excalibur with his bare hand, so I don't know why this guy has no survivability at all whatsoever, but that power mod, the Enema Elish special power mod that he has, I think is so nice for him because pretty much wherever you're bringing him, whether it be a boss fight or a farming node, whatever have you, this thing is pretty much always going to be live. There are very few servants that are not weak to Enema Elish. Which is why, for the longest time, I pretty much brought Gil to every single boss fight because he was my favorite character, and because he always had that bonus power mod, he always just smacked people with his big rod, just beating everybody down, and that's a huge part, I think, of what makes Gilgamesh good, is that this guy just reliably does a bunch of damage. His base damage is now the highest out of all of the Buster AoE archers. The only person that kind of gets close is Napoleon and Arjuna, but Arjuna kind of blows hot dog water, and Napoleon has some really good offensive buffs, but they only last for one turn, at least the really high peaks of them, so that's a little bit annoying for him, whereas Gilgamesh, all of his stuff is just live. He's got a solid attack buff, he has really high NP damage, which does pair very nicely with Oberon. Having that NP damage and having some compatibility with that guy will always be a plus. That will always be a good thing. He's got a solid battery. The second skill NP gain buff pairs very nicely with his hits because he just has 5 hits on everything and 8 on the extra attack, which is really good for him. And then I know you mostly use the skill for the battery, but the star weight's not bad either because as an archer, he already has naturally high star weight, but you know, if you want to use him with something like a Reigns, or you're bringing him into a multi-core type setup for a boss fight or for farming, and you need to get those face cards because not everybody has, you know, like an NP3 or higher servant, you know, laying around, it can be nice that he can fight for those stars. The only things that he's really lacking are crit damage and a method of survivability, and I think crit damage for Gilgamesh would serve him kinda well. But in all honesty, if they just chuck him some survivability, I think the guy is pretty much fine. Like I said, Gilgamesh will always be a good servant. I believe that was something I was talking about a couple of months ago as one of the poster children of Fate, and I believe the character that has been in the most Fate works, I think he now has that title. He's just always going to be a good servant. Maybe you could also give him something like Pierce Invincibility, or he removes buffs, because it's really weird that you can proc a dodge and dodge something as insane as Enema Elish. But while there are a lot of other Buster AoE archers that I think do more than Gilgamesh, the fact is his base damage is just really good to push through even some boss fights. I know you want to use single targets generally, but even his base damage without the power mod is really strong, and then you take into account that his power mod is almost always going to be live. There's just a certain point where you're just doing so much damage that you gotta give the guys their props. That, sure, he doesn't have anything fancy, you know, survivability, no ramping damage, nothing like that, but he's just a really strong beat stick, and sometimes a beat stick is just good enough. Now this one I think might be a little bit controversial, but believe you me that I almost put him at the second place slot, because he's almost the inverse of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is so insanely high with the free damage that it's really hard to not place him very highly on lists like this, because he's just gonna smack everybody, and I mean everyone, with pretty much the most free power mod in the game. Tomoe's the opposite. He does way more than Gilgamesh does. I mean, his skills are chock full of very powerful effects, but if you want to get to similar levels of damage, you really gotta bust an arm and a leg getting to that position. I mean, if you want him to outdamage Gilgamesh, you have to get an almost mythical scenario. You have to proc his guts, let his third skill be active twice, be on a waterside battlefield, fight a lawful enemy, and then you'll be out damaging Gilgamesh, which is a little bit insane. Now, I don't think the individual pieces of that are all that hard to get on their own. Fight a lawful enemy? Well, sure. I mean, you just look at the node. Who am I going to be fighting? Ah, it's this person. Let me just go beat him up. And then the mechanical archery is really not all that difficult either, because you just stockpile those buffs and you can do one really big burst turn of damage, or you can kind of do an NP on turn 2 and then turn 4, so you technically got 2 little big nukes going on in there. Water side is really the only thing you kinda can't control, because the battlefield is either water side or it's not. Thankfully, water side is a pretty abundant battlefield type, but I feel like you would notice it if you're not using them on those battlefields. But it's one of those servants that you kind of have to think about when you want to use them. Now, I know that's not entirely popular with the larger community, because Miss Crane, I think, is very, very strong and is criminally underused, but most of the people that I ask, well, why are you not using this servant when you have them? They say, too much thinking involved. I can't be bothered to think of a plan, when it's really not that difficult to do. FGO is not that complex of a game. Same thing with Summer Chloe, who I think, like Miss Crane, suffers from team cost being a little too low to make use of these really weird setups. But some people will just say, I'm just going to stick to my double Koyanskaya, setup, because that's way easier. And admittedly, they are right. It is easier to do. But Tomoe is almost just, well, you can get pretty free damage if you just know what you're going to go fight, and I mean, the wiki and game press are always there, and we kind of know about these things 2 years in advance, so it's really hard to not know when he's going to be really good into a fight. And so the real benefit for this guy is you kind of just use him like a better Ishtar in a way, where Ishtar, you pop her skill, and then you use the NP on the next turn. For Tomoe, it's kind of like the same thing. You start increasing your NP damage, and you get to modulate how much damage you want to do. Do you want to stack up all 5 to do an insanely massive nuclear bomb? Or again, do you want to get like 2 buffs and then maybe use the other 3 on turn 5? Something along those lines. You have the freedom to modulate the damage you want to do, and he's especially kind of good for more modern setups and stuff, because if you want to do a multi-core setup, well, you can just let him sit in the back and build up his damage while everybody else is clearing wave 1 and 2. Then he comes in. You've probably also selected him for this setup because it's a lawful, aligned enemy, or you're fighting on a water side battlefield, or both, hopefully. And then you can really just let him absolutely nuke whoever he's fighting. And then it also helps that if you want to bring him into challenge quests, the guy is chock full of really good effects of going into different boss fights. I mean, he bypasses everything. That is not nothing. Being able to get around invincibility and defense, and then the Pierce Evasion I know I ragged on, but the Tomoe boss actually did beat me up because my Izo was about to take him out. I popped a dodge, and he didn't have his NP ready, so he just said, alright, screw it, third skill, Pierce Evasion, now you're dead, buddy. And I was like, oh, well, that really sucks. So it is really good for those corner cases when you don't have the NP available, but you want to get around dodge. He's got it for 5 turns. I mean, bro has a guts, like I mentioned in the video. It has bonus effects, but you should look at it kind of like a Nemo or an Andromeda type thing, where it's a bonus for you. If they took all that off, it would still be a good skill. You'd be like, oh, okay, we have a guts with the battery. That's really nice. But they decided to give him additional effects on there, where he's able to debuff cleanse himself, and he's able to get an additional NP damage buff if his guts is procced. So it's just, again, a little bonus that you get if it does actually proc. It shouldn't be looked at something to strive and try to get, but something that is just nice to have. And overall, I just feel like he's a very well-balanced servant. Again, well-balanced in the way of more modern FGO, so he's not game-breakingly busted or anything, but I'm really glad that he's on every single banner, because maybe you don't have Saint Quartz to go for Gilgamesh when he's around, or Tesla being story locked, you just don't want to summon for him when he comes around. You're trying to save for somebody else. We have a lot of bangers coming out next year. This is a really good guy that's going to be able to be picked up for free whenever they run out 5-star tickets, or you could just get spooked by him on banners, which is also really nice because that means his NP level is technically easier and more probable to get raised than some of these other guys, which is, again, very helpful. So I just felt like I really had to go to bat for this dude, because I know not everybody is the biggest fan of him. I know he's really cool looking and everybody agrees on that, but some people will look at his base damage and say, oh, that's really stinky base damage. But you have so many variables that are in your control that you can modulate how much damage this guy can do. And then outside of that, he's just got everything else you really would want a servant to do. Bypassing things, really good survivability, My boy can do crits unlike the guys in the first and second positions on this list, and is just overall a very, very nice servant. 4th and 5th place was really hard for me to get this one pinned down, and this is one of the ones that I think might be a bit more debatable in the comments, because I myself am kinda settled on Ishtar at 4 and then Napoleon at 5, which we'll talk about in just a second. But it is a bit rough because neither one of these servants have really gotten the same love as, say, someone like Gilgamesh or especially Tesla. And also for Ishtar's case, she's quite old as a servant. She was, what, year 1, year 2? And the same thing can also be said for Napoleon, because I believe he's a year 3 servant, and we're now in year 9. I mean, the span for when he released to where we are now, I mean, is longer than he's been out. I mean, it's kind of crazy. He is a 6-year-old servant, so the fact that, I mean, he could still kind of hold up to this day, I think is remarkable. But I went with Ishtar at number 4 over here because, one, I think she just has a very basic good kit. Now, I'm not saying basic in the way that, that's really bad, it's really terrible. No, I think in FGO, the more streamlined or basic, for lack of a better term, your kit is, the better you're probably going to be. The more you stay to, say, a checklist, which is really unfortunate, of do you have a battery? Do you have a card buff? Do you have X, Y, or Z? Do you have all these standard good stuff? The easier it is for you to be a really good servant. The more you try to move into a niche is where things kind of get a bit iffy. I mean, you can look at Tomoe being a recent release, and he's, I don't think, as good as, say, Tesla or Gilgamesh. In the fact that I think he's doing a lot of really good things, but he's almost got too many niches to be the best. He's certainly very, very strong, but when you need a god scenario to get all of his things popping off, and, you know, all the stars have to align in a perfect way for him to do this insane-o amount of damage, it's just not very realistic. But at least for Ishtar, her damage is quite good, and her gimmick, quote-unquote, is you pop the 3rd skill, and you wait a turn, and then you get big damage. The only thing that's a little bit annoying is kind of using Ishtar in modern Buster teams. It is a bit weird because you have to delay the buff to get it, which is stuff that I think modern Buster teams don't particularly like, especially because the 3rd skill buff specifically says it is unstackable. If that was stackable, I think she might actually be in that Gilgamesh territory of, they do so much damage for free that they kind of have to be really high. Because do you know how easy it is to loop this 3rd skill? It's on a 3-turn cooldown. You could pop this on turn 2, and then use the Koyan Skies to immediately loop it again. But unfortunately, they said it's unstackable, so you can't have a 100% attack buff. If they ever remove that, by the way, this might be a little bit nutty. Which, to be fair, I might be able to see them doing. I could see them doing something like that to kind of help her out. But I mean, Ishtar does have a lot of other good things going for her. She does have a 50% battery, which is really nice. Technically, she does have Pierce Invincibility, and she does have 1 turn of Invincibility as well, but they are 80% chances, which, every time I use Ishtar, the 80% chance more so just feels like an 80% chance to fail. I never can get both of them to align, or I really need the Pierce Invul, but they give me the Invincibility, or neither one of them, but technically they are there. If they want to give her, say, a Tesla style of buff, where maybe she gives herself buff success rate of 20% for a turn, that could be really nice. Because then she would have reliable survivability, and she would have Pierce Invul, which is quite good to have. Her charisma, I also can't knock, is quite strong, giving the entire party 20% attack and 20% crit damage, where she bombs 20 stars on her NP. I believe during year 1 when she came out, there was a damage tryout that Ishtar was one of the best servants to use, because she had a big battery, she could do crit damage, and she would provide stars for herself, so overall, her damage was not bad for those trials. I don't remember when that actually was, so somebody in the comments can let me know, but I do believe a lot of people were saying, oh, Ishtar's probably the easiest one to use because she kind of just does everything for herself, which is really nice. But aside from that, she is unfortunately rather basic, and in that same vein, while she did check the checklist, I would say for the time when she released, she is missing other things. You know, you would like her to have guaranteed survivability. You know, that Pierce Invul would be nice if I could also rely on it. You know, getting a power mod is something that people really care about nowadays. And while you can stack the 1st skill, other Buster servants can stack better things. Say, for instance, Tomoe himself can stack his 50% Buster up twice when doing Buster farming. So where Ishtar can't get that 50% attack buff up twice, he can. He can have 100% Buster up, which is a little bit nutty. Same thing for Gilgamesh being able to loop the attack buff and the NP damage on his first skill. When you have powerful effects like that you can buff stack because Koyanskaya allows you to do that, I think that does lend to them being a bit better in the modern meta, and it's just unfortunate that while Ishtar has really good base damage, that's kind of all she's got to work with, which I do think is a little unfortunate for her, but I don't doubt that she'll get a buff in the future that could help her out. Now, the reason I prefer Ishtar to Napoleon is strictly because his first and second skill, the real height for this guy, are both only one turn, which is a product of his time, unfortunately. They do allow him to have the charisma attack buff for 3 turns, but unfortunately, after you do that first big turn, you lose out on that additional 20% attack buff and the 20% NP damage. It's also a little bit cruddy that you lose on the 100% star gen rate, although he does do that for the entire party, and that is quite good, but Caskill does that, so you could probably let Napoleon do it as well. I don't think it's that broken. But at the very least, they did give him a very decent battery at 30%. He does have guaranteed Pierce Invul, and he is a star genning machine, with the second skill, the third skill refunding stars every turn, and then embalming 20 stars every single turn. He is kind of just providing a whole plethora of stars. Unfortunately, he doesn't have his own crit damage buff, which is really upsetting in the way that Ishtar can bomb some stars, and it's not a massive crit damage buff, but she at least has one. For some reason, Napoleon is completely dependent on having a support give him those crit damage buffs, or at least, I don't know, maybe you give him a CE that gives him base crit damage, or you're going to give him a command code that gives him extra crit damage, but he doesn't natively have it, which is really unfortunate. Now, the thing I would say that he's known for is the anti-divinity power mod, which admittedly is very strong. It's one of the reasons I was considering pushing him above Ishtar, because his base damage is better than hers. You can get his first and second skill back for wave 3s if you're going to use him for farming, and anti-divine is really good. But it's also the fact of considering, well, overall, who do I think is better? And I'm like, well, technically, Ishtar does have the Pierce Invul, and she does have the survivability, and those are things that you can bring, say, a support in, and they can actually guarantee those for her. Even though she can't get those, she can get those provided. And the same thing could be said for Napoleon with getting crit damage, but then at that point, I think Ishtar is benefiting a little bit more, because her kit, I think, is better well-rounded than Napoleon's is. Whereas when you go into CQs, Napoleon is a little bit frustrating to use, because even though you can stack his first and second skill, the Buster team is very, very dependent on finishing these fights in 3 turns, because unlike the Quick team, they at least have Scotty's NP that can give them a dodge. Buster team ain't got nothing if you're using double Koyanskaya. You are a sitting duck out there if you do not obliterate the enemy. And especially if you're looking at some of these servants at NP1, Napoleon can very easily whiff on being able to take some of these guys out. And then at that point, you're kinda cooked. However, I can see an argument for Napoleon being over Ishtar, because again, his base damage is a bit higher than hers, and then anti-divine is really good. He has the Pierce Invul, Pierce Defense combo, and while Ishtar does have that as well, you kinda have to go out of your way to bring a servant or a support, a CE, a command code, whatever have you, to make sure that she can get those. So it is a little bit more annoying. And even as I've been talking about Napoleon, I'm kind of convincing myself in the middle of this that I might like him at number 4, but that should just go to tell you how close I think these two are. Ishtar is very generic, which is very strong and good, but Napoleon can hit some higher highs, but his kit I don't think is as well-rounded, which I think is a little bit unfortunate. And fine, I guess we'll talk about Arjuna, the very, very sad state that this servant is in, because unlike some of these other servants, they've given this guy a lot of love. They've buffed the NP, they buffed skill 1, they buffed skill 2, but he's still not very great. I mean, sure, his base damage is pretty decent until you remember that, oh yeah, that all comes from the third skill, which at a glance is strong. Getting a Buster and an NP damage buff, that's pretty good, but it's both for 1 turn, which is a little bit frustrating, which one means that if you want to use him in some Buster comps with Koyanskaya, you can't really buff stack it, which is one of the better things that Buster comps can do. But then also, he just kind of does no damage as soon as this goes away. And I mean, if we're talking about CQs, he might have a better kit than Napoleon and Ishtar because, you know, he's got the battery and functionally has a better version of Merlin's NP, giving himself 2k HP, 8 stars instead of 5, and then 10% NP every single turn, and they're all for 5 turns as well. They literally gave him Merlin's NP as a skill, plus the battery, and somehow this guy is still not good. I don't know how you just mess a servant up that bad. And then there's also his first skill, which going into CQs is not bad. I mean, the critical start generation rate is, you know, that's whatever. I mean, it doesn't have very high hits on his cards anyway, so sure, give that to him. But 5 turns of debuff immunity on a 6-turn cooldown? You're telling me this guy is like permanently debuff immune? That's kind of crazy. That's really nuts. But then I think where he got the ultimate short end of the stick was the NP. So he releases around when Karna does. Karna gets a anti-divinity power mod, and then when they buff his NP, they give him buster resistance down. So he's getting free bonus damage, plus the NP scaling from a buffed NP, plus his power mod is good. I mean, that was one of the reasons I was almost going to bump Napoleon above Ishtar. That's like the main thing I think he's got going for him in that debate. But for Arjuna, they gave him insta-kill and bonus insta-kill on divinity enemies. I mean, he reduces enemy defense by 20% for 3 turns, but it doesn't proc first. So what, you're supposed to loop his NP 2 or 3 times on an enemy, get 60% defense down, then pop the 3rd skill and do a bunch of damage? I don't really know what they were cooking with this one, but I really wanted to have some kind of controversial take and say, oh, maybe Arjuna's not the worst one, but I can't even make some random cope for my Arjuna fans out there, if there are any, because as much as they've tried to buff this guy and help him out, they're just doing everything in the wrong way. Again, I think it says enough that you have Merlin's NP on your skills. It's something you can just pop like that. You have that, and it's better as well. And somehow you're managing to not only be the worst of the Buster AoE archers, but it's not even a discussion. I mean, at least Ishtar and Napoleon, they're really old, and they have both gotten, what, 1 buff each? But they're still really competitive with one another, and I can definitely see some people in the comments will say, well, actually, I like Ishtar a bit more than Tomoe. I think those guys are crazy, and I would encourage them to use Tomoe a little bit more. He did just come out, after all. Give him a little bit of time. Once you guys get to play some future events, and, you know, bring him to some boss fights, bring him to some free quests, you know, you'll see that he's actually pretty good. But I can't see that for Arjuna. It's going to be one contrarian maybe in the comments saying, well, actually, I used Arjuna to blah, 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 beat Kiara. And it's like, bro, everybody could beat Kiara, all right? That's not really an achievement. I'm sure if you wanted to, you could bring Angra Mindy to beat Kiara. I mean, there are solos of people using Medea Lily to solo through the Kiara fight. If something that ridiculous can happen, I think you could pretty much do anything in this game. So sorry to leave it off on kind of a more negative note, but I did feel I had to address Arjuna and say, Lasengo, what are you guys doing, bro? This is one of your more well-known servants. Like, Karna and Arjuna are a really big deal. They're like the main 2 guys for one of the biggest, I think, like, stories on the planet. It's like an insanely popular story. I mean, I found out about it at university when we were given it as an assignment to read. I didn't find out about it from Fate. Some dude at my college was like, we're gonna read this, and then you're gonna give me a report on it. So, bro, fix this guy, please. And for my viewers watching, if you want me to do another one of these, throw it down in the comments down below. Again, I love discussing Fate stuff. This one was a little bit more relaxed than, say, the Summer Servant video. But if you guys want, I can go back into more, you know, scripted mode with these videos, or if you just like them being a little bit more free-flowing, where I still have some notes and stuff in front of me, but obviously I don't think they sound as rehearsed, even though I kind of have rehearsed them a little bit and I do have notes, but I was like, let me just have a little bit more fun with this video. So let me know that in the comments down below as well. And if you stuck around this long, I mean, you might as well drop a like and subscribe to the channel, because I do this every single day, and I also stream 3 times a week. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So why don't you come hang out? Even if we're not playing FGO or something, I'll still answer your FGO questions. And sometimes, I've been known to stream other games on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So if FGO's not really your speed, maybe Arknights is, maybe a little bit of Star Rail, maybe a little bit of Wuthering Waves, maybe I'll play the Elden Ring DLC, who knows? But with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here. You guys have yourselves a nice day, and I'll catch y'all on the flippity floppity.